It's sometimes easy to forget when we're in the throes of this major American political crisis that this is happening elsewhere in the world, right? It's a pandemic. It's all over the place. And it's not just the United States that is angry at China for unleashing this on the world. A lot of other countries are as well. Probably there's going to be some kind of international response. We just don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet. So let's try to figure it out. Luckily, we're joined right now by Nile Gardiner, who is the director of the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He's a former advisor to the Iron Lady herself, Margaret Thatcher, and has been a leading voice for the past several years on the Brexit debate. And now we've got to turn to another matter of international diplomacy and international crisis. Niall, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
So, Niall, I speak as an American. I am furious at China. I want to punish China for what they have done here. And the United States can't punish China too much because we're so intertwined. Our economies are so intertwined. They buy up all of our debt. They manufacture everything for us. So this is a very difficult position that we find ourselves in. What does the point of view look like across the pond over in Britain? And what do you think an international response to China could look like after this is all over?
Well, I think firstly, in the UK, there's been a significant hardening of the position towards China. And just earlier this morning, Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, who is deputising for Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, as he recovers from the coronavirus, Dominic Raab said that it can no longer be business as usual with China.
Yeah.
And he said that, and his government has said that the UK will be basically reassessing its overall relationship with China in the wake of the coronavirus. And I think it's going to be the same situation across Europe, actually. There's a lot of anger, of course, with how China has handled the virus. There is a lot of dissatisfaction with China's complete lack of transparency, its lack of cooperation as well with Western countries. And I think you are going to see a very significant backlash, not only from the UK, but across Europe against China, especially over China's leading telecommunications company, Huawei, which has attempted to gain a very big foothold in European telecommunications markets over the last 2 decades. I think you're going to see a big backlash against Huawei and Huawei's growing role inside Europe.
Well, speaking of Huawei, I mean, this is going to be a big question for the United Kingdom. I hosted a show with Senator Ted Cruz and Nigel Farage a couple of months ago in D.C., the topic of which was Huawei, because, this Chinese tech company is offering to go in at very, very low prices and build everybody's 5G systems for them. And you got to remember, China is a pretty dishonest actor around the world, and there's no such thing as a free lunch. So you always wonder what is going to come along with them building this expensive infrastructure for people. I mean, just specifically on the question of Huawei, is there a world in which the United Kingdom basically says, all right, get out of here, everybody. Everything we were talking about 2 months ago is over. We need to go it alone here or reassess who our allies are?
Yeah, I think that, with regard to Huawei, you are going to see the government completely reassessing Huawei's involvement in the UK's 5G network. And earlier in the year, the British government agreed to allow Huawei a 35% stake in the UK's 5G network. But that, of course, was a huge strategic error of judgment by the British government. I think it could well reverse course. And Huawei is already, of course, deeply embedded in the UK telecommunications network. It has been now for nearly 2 decades. It played a lead role in building, 3G, 4G in the UK. But I think that with regard to 5G, I do think that there's a strong chance now that the government will sunset Huawei's involvement. There's a growing conservative parliamentary rebellion against the Huawei decision. And many conservative MPs are very unhappy about the idea of Huawei having a 35% stake in 5G. And so I do think there's a very good chance now the government will backtrack on the Huawei decision, and that Huawei will be told within a couple of years it needs to be out of the UK networks altogether. And I do think as well the same thing could happen across Europe. in countries such as Germany as well, where Huawei has tried to establish a real foothold. So the tide is certainly starting to turn against Huawei. I think the coronavirus pandemic has been a wake-up call to many policymakers in the UK and all over Europe. And at the end of the day, you simply cannot trust a Chinese state-owned entity like Huawei. All Chinese companies basically report to the Chinese state.
Yeah.
And while they may claim to be private enterprises, they are in fact really answering to the beck and call of the Chinese Communist Party. And so there's no distinction between a company like Huawei and the Chinese state.
There's no distinction at all, and yet this seems to have persisted. I remember when I first heard about this Huawei issue, I said, "Oh, who cares? We've already got Chinese companies building everything else for us. Why is this a big deal?" But of course, it's a big deal because it has national security implications. We know that China has spied on us. They put spyware into their technology. And when it comes to the United States and the UK, we have something called Five Eyes, right? These major intelligence organizations that share intelligence with one another. Well, if you've got Huawei, a Chinese enterprise with such a huge stake there in the United Kingdom, that might make us reassess our relationship, right? Because four eyes is better than six eyes when the sixth eye is going to be China. For decades now, we've been told there is no downside to forget just about, installing 5G. There's no downside to unfettered trade with China. There's no downside to outsourcing jobs to China. There's no downside to sending all of our manufacturing over to China. Now it looks like we're seeing the downside, even beyond the question of UK or US-China relations. What does this mean for globalization? I remember President Trump ran against globalization. The whole Brexit movement was sort of against the growth of these international enterprises. As we move forward, are we going to see a resurgence of nationalism? Is this the end of globalism, or am I overstating things because we're in the middle of a pandemic?
I think that while on the one hand, certainly you are going to see the continuation of trade between the West and China, that's going to continue, but you are going to see a significant tightening of national security restrictions in terms of dealing with Chinese companies, and Huawei is a prime example of that. Huawei really is a national security threat to the United Kingdom, to the United States, and to the Western world. So I think you're going to see a significant tightening there. Also, I think there's going to be a greater focus, certainly in the US and in Western countries, upon producing more at home, so that Western countries are not reliant upon China during a time of crisis like this. For example, China produces a lot of pharmaceuticals, for example, that are used in the West, and a lot of products that are vital to the West. And I think that you're going to see, I think, the US, UK, other countries taking the lead in reducing dependency upon China. That's going to be a very big change in the course of the next few years. And certainly you're going to see as well perhaps a more adversarial relationship between the West and China. And China is no friend of the free world. China is an authoritarian government that poses a significant threat to the West.
Right.